be speaking to Yasser Munif, who teaches at Emerson College in Boston and is active with the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. He is Syrian himself and is presently in Boston. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
When we talk about Syria, it's hard to know where to begin, which horror to begin with, but maybe we could get to the worst first, torture. Last month, the United Nations had an exhibit called Caesar Photos Inside Syrian Authorities' Prisons. Supposedly these were photos by a former Syrian military photographer who had defected. Are you familiar with the photos in this man Caesar?
I am. So Caesar was actually working with the Syrian regime, and he was basically documenting all the bodies that were tortured and killed in prison. And apparently there was a whole system to document those bodies, because the Syrian regime didn't always trust the officers who were doing the torture and so on, and they wanted a material proof of their torturing and their killing. So he was basically taking the pictures and putting different numbers and on the bodies, and he was able to leak more than 50,000 pictures.
50,000?
50,000, yeah.
Wow.
And according to some experts who looked at the pictures and studied them for quite some time, there are the pictures of around 11,000 prisoners, their dead bodies. So we know that the Syrian regime killed at least 11,000, but the more accurate number is around 50,000 people were tortured and killed in Syrian prisons.
I couldn't say that number again?
50,000 at least, because it's very hard to know who's been killed, who's been disappeared, who's still in prison, because there is no communication with prisoners.
Now, every fact in the war in Syria is doubted by one side or another, so I've heard it said these pictures might be fakes because, as the argument goes, why would the Syrian army want to take pictures of atrocities that could get them in trouble, etc.? What do you say to that?
As I said, it was a way for the Syrian regime to document, and it's part of the bureaucracy. So because many of the security guards were actually being bribed by the families of the inmates or the prisoners, and would release some of those prisoners for $100 or $500 and so on. The Syrian regime needed proof that they were actually tortured and killed, to prevent that kind of transactions between the guards and the families. So, I mean, experts have seen the pictures. I've seen some of the pictures. It's very hard to create those pictures from thin air. And what's interesting is, more recently, there were pictures of one of the camps where the bodies were tortured and killed, and it's actually less than 500 meters or less than a kilometer away from the presidential palace. And this is documented. I mean, you could, if you do a search on the internet, you can see those pictures, and people have recognized that camp, which is close to the presidential palace, very close. So there are too many proofs that show the veracity of these pictures.
Yeah, maybe this is a naive question, but this has been exposed now for a number of months. Has the regime pulled back? Is there less torture and executions, or does anyone...
No, not really. Obviously, this has been one of the strategies of the Syrian regime, because the space is limited in the prisons, and the buildings or the schools that the Syrian regime is using to put the prisoners. It's been killing many of them. Plus, the cost of keeping them alive is too high, and the Syrian regime prefers to allocate that funding on the military and so on. So the easiest and cheapest way to deal with the prisoners oftentimes is to kill them, torture them and kill them. Plus that sends a very strong message to activists and organizers, basically telling them that the cost is very high if they want to be involved. But Cesar didn't actually release all the pictures. He released only a few recently, and then more were released, and they were published in a Syrian website called Zaman al-Wasal. And that's the tragedy. There was a big debate about whether those pictures should be seen or not, because of the loved ones, and people are still looking for their sons and fathers and uncles and so on. And then the website decided to release them without blurring them, and people have used that database to recognize their loved ones. So people go to that website, and they've been recognizing a lot of them, and putting names and faces to those oftentimes tortured and mutilated bodies.
If I may, I want to switch now to Yarmouk refugee camp. We hear that ISIS, assisted by al-Nusra, has taken over the Palestinian refugee camp there, where perhaps 18,000 were still living while under siege by the Assad government. Is that a fair summary of what's been happening?
It is. The tragedy with the Yarmouk camp, the Palestinian Yarmouk camp, it's the largest Palestinian camp within and outside Palestine. And at some point before the Syrian revolution, some 200,000 Palestinians lived in it. And before the militarization of the Syrian revolution and the camp, another 200,000 people moved into the camp because it was safe and it was welcoming others and so on. But then some of the FSA corrupt groups entered the camp and started the militarization of the camp, and the Syrian regime started bombing the camp in December 2012 and started besieging it. And so it's been besieged for more than 700 days now. And the water was cut in September 2013, so it's been almost a year and a half now. So people are digging wells, and that's very expensive to do. So not everyone can do it. The humanitarian situation is extremely bad right now. But at some point, the Yarmouk camp was basically paradise for activists and organizers. It was attracting people from all over. They were coming to the Yarmouk camp to basically educate the kids and provide medical relief and work relief. There were several field hospitals that were very helpful for the surrounding areas and so on. And then the siege started, and more than 200 people were killed during that siege out of starvation and hunger. So the situation in the Yarmouk camp before ISIS attacked it was very dire and extremely difficult and painful for the population. What's interesting about the camp is it represents like a microcosm for the Syrian revolution and Syrian society, in a sense. There was a lot of secular groups and activists who were organizing within it, and then at some point some corrupt military groups started entering it, and then the Islamists started entering it and imposing the veil on women and trying to impose the Sharia on people. And then they established a local council that was very close to the Islamists. So people were working outside the local council, and the local council was really useless, providing services like removing garbage and so on, but really not very operative or functional. So that was the situation before the ISIS attack. And then I think ISIS attacked the camp for its symbolic significance. We have to remember that ISIS has been defeated in several locations in Syria and in Iraq, Kobani more recently, but also in Tikrit and other areas. And therefore it needed a very powerful and symbolic space or site to attack and take over. And Yarmouk was that perfect place, because it represents the coexistence of Palestinian and Syrians. It represents the Palestinian struggle against the Syrian regime and their resilience. And what's interesting is what's happening in the Yarmouk camp is very representative of what's happening in Syria. The Syrian regime was besieging the camp, and ISIS started attacking it, and al-Nusra was inside it. People were, to a certain extent, accepting al-Nusra because it's not as violent and harsh as ISIS. But now it's clear that those two groups, ISIS and al-Nusra, converge. They have the same ideology. And ISIS opened the way al-Nusra opened the way to ISIS to enter the camp and prevented the FSA groups and the Islamic Front in Yalda and other neighboring cities to come and defend the camp. And now I think the camp has been completely taken over. There might be some pockets where Aknaf al-Maqdis, who is the FSA group active inside the camp, which is close to Hamas. So there might be some pockets inside the camp, but ISIS was able to take it over. The other tragedy is that the PLO has been very neutral, and the reason is because Aknaf al-Maqdis are close to Hamas, so they weren't willing to take any stance, and in a way they were facilitating the siege of the Palestinian population and its suffering. On the other hand, a number of different Palestinian groups close to the Syrian regime, for example, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, led by Ahmed Jibril, and Fatah al-Intifada, both were actually enforcing that siege of the Palestinian camp.
Right.
So that's the situation right now. And the population is caught in the middle. On the one hand, the Syrian regime is attacking the north of the camp and dropping barrel bombs. I think some 20 or 22 so far since April 1st. And ISIS was attacking from the other side. And what's interesting is now the war is going to stop because ISIS doesn't want to open the front with the Syrian regime.
So wait a second. Say that again. The war is going to stop?
I mean, the conflict within the Yarmouk camp is going to stop because it's being controlled by ISIS on the one hand and the Syrian regime on the other, which took part of the northern area, and therefore they're not going to fight. They just wanted to get rid of the secular, more popular kind of military groups, Aknaf al-Maqdis. So once that's done, they're not going to have a conflict or open a new front. So that's very telling, and it shows how much there is almost like coordination between ISIS and the Syrian regime in many fronts, although sometimes there are clashes in some areas, but for the most part, they don't really open fronts against each other, but rather attack the other groups who represent and are more representative of the Syrian revolution.
Now Friday there's a protest in New York City about Yarmouk. It's pretty hopeless, or what can be said? What can be said?
It's not clear. Now ISIS is actually attacking other areas that neighboring the Yarmouk camp, Yalda and others, and is taking over some territory. And part of the reason is some of those Islamist and FSA groups have been very undemocratic and unpopular, and in some cases kidnapping and killing some of the activists and imposing their Sharia law on some areas and so on. So they're not necessarily organically implanted in those areas, and they're not as powerful as ISIS and as well equipped, and that's why they're easily defeated sometimes. So it's not clear what's going to happen, but the groups fighting ISIS on the eastern side of the camp now, the Army of Islam, Sham al-Rasul and Jaysh al-Arabil are still fighting, but it's not clear if they're going to be able to liberate the camp or not.
Well, what I mean is, at the protest, what do you think the demands should be? What should the people be saying about Yarmouk?
I think that there is still a very large section of the Syrian population that's still supporting the Syrian revolution and still fighting and still willing to risk its life to overthrow the Syrian despot. And so I think we need to make that struggle much more visible and send a clear message against those Islamist corrupt groups that claim to be part of the revolution, in addition to denouncing what ISIS and al-Nusra are doing, which is obviously against the revolution. For a long period, people were conflating the revolution with those extremist groups that don't belong to the revolution and are actually undermining the revolution. And sending a strong message to Assad. So the Syrian revolution is caught in between those two fronts.
What
the
about
regime on the one hand and al-Nusra, ISIS, and some of the Islamist groups who claim to be part of the revolution.
What about demands on Iran and Russia, telling them to get out and stop supporting us?
Obviously, sure. I think Iran has no business to be in Syria, and Russia should stop intervening in Syria, and likewise Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and all these should also stop funding the most reactionary and radical groups, and the campaign, the U.S. campaign in northern Syria should also be stopped.
And then what about Israel? And there's reports, and the government's not denying this, that the Israeli government is treating al-Nusra fighters and sending them back to Syria to fight.
I haven't heard of al-Nusra fighters, but I've heard of other fighters being treated in Israel. Obviously, this is a part of a PR campaign that the Israeli are doing. Those are very exceptional and few cases. But Israel, for the most part, is happy with the war of attrition. Basically, that leads to the destruction of the Syrian society and infrastructure, and the dismantling and weakening of the Syrian army, and so on, and also Hezbollah and Iran. So Israel is very happy with the ongoing war without intervening. I mean, there is such a dynamic that doesn't require any kind of Israeli intervention.
Well, what about that report in the Wall Street Journal that said that they had treated 2,000 al-Nusra fighters and had patched them up and brought them back to Syria?
I don't think that's accurate. I mean, the cases I know of and have been documented and we've seen pictures are very few. But yeah, I think that this is really an inflated number just for PR campaign for Israel.
Wow, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, speaking as an American, al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda killed 3,000 of us on September 11th, and then the Israelis think it's a good thing to be known to be helping al-Nusra. I mean, that's bizarre.
I haven't heard of al-Nusra fighters being treated in Israel, although I don't know, but I haven't heard of that. I've heard of other fighters, but not al-Nusra.
All right, what about the U.S. role? You know, when we talked in October, you predicted U.S. bombing would help ISIS and Assad. Now, looking back at that prediction, what do you say?
So I think that for the most part, what happened in Kobani was to a certain extent successful in preventing ISIS from taking the city over from the Kurdish fighters, the Peshmerga and the YPG and the Free Syrian Army. But there is a reason for that. The reason is that the city is empty, and the entire Kurdish population actually left the city and went to Turkey, 160,000 of them. And that led to much more flexibility in bombing different locations in the city and targeting ISIS fighters and ISIS units. This is not true for other areas, and wherever else the U.S. campaign has targeted ISIS, it's killed many civilians. That's true for Raqqa. It's true for some areas in the countryside of Aleppo and so on and so forth, and obviously in Iraq. And this is basically a recipe to recruit more fighters. Because no one obviously likes receiving bombs, and the population, when they receive the bombs, they feel that their only protection is ISIS, and ISIS used that as a very effective recruitment mechanism or ideology. So I don't think that on the long term this strategy could be successful, and we've seen it by backfiring in different areas where ISIS is becoming more stronger and so on.
Now, is the Assad regime in big trouble? I mean, it lost this big city, Idlib, and now has ISIS in Yarmouk, just a few miles from the heart of Damascus. Are Assad's forces teetering, or is this just another of the back and forth moments of war?
I think that this year and possibly next year are going to be extremely crucial in this conflict. The Syrian regime is reaching, I think, its tipping point, not only militarily but also in many other areas. The Syrian regime lost Idlib recently, but also Busra, and several checkpoints on the Jordanian-Syrian borders, which are very important. And the opposition is advancing in a number of different areas in the Idlib neighborhood. It also was able, the opposition was able to also prevent a major attack in the Aleppo countryside, where the Syrian regime, in addition to Afghani soldiers and Iranian commanders and so on, were trying to take over some territory and besiege Aleppo, and that was prevented. And the opposition is taking back some of those territories. So militarily, the Syrian regime is not in a very good shape. And the Iranian regime is obviously seeing that and has been pouring a lot of money and is not necessarily willing or could still do that in the future. So it might look for alternatives. It's not clear whether this is going to happen soon, but the Iranian regime is looking for alternatives. In addition to that, the economy is in a very dire situation. The Syrian regime tried to stabilize the Syrian pound, but now it reached one of its highest exchange values. Just before the revolution, the exchange rate between the Syrian pound and the dollar was 50. Now it's more than 250. And this is obviously very detrimental to the Syrian economy and to the regime. Plus, the regime is not able to recruit more fighters. It's been completely depleted, and the coast where most of the fighters are coming, most of the Alawite live in Syria, are on the coast in Latakia and Tartus. There is a mounting resistance and a feeling of betrayal and a feeling that the Alawite have sacrificed too much for too little, and they don't see any horizon. So the Syrian regime is facing a number of challenges that I don't think, and those are structural challenges that I don't think it is able to solve.
Could I end by talking about your participation in the World Social Forum in Tunis last month?
Sure.
When was that exactly?
So that was end of March. This is the second participation we had at the World Social Forum. First was in 2013. The second just 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to do is basically try to raise awareness and consciousness about the Syrian revolution, and try to break the siege of the Syrian revolution, make it more visible. A number of different things are happening in Syria. Activists are still working in many areas. Different type of activists. There's nurses and doctors and media activists and journalists and filmmakers, engineers. They're working in revolutionary councils and revolutionary courts, and in bakeries, and there are the revolutionary teachers and so on. And so we want to make that.
These are not been taken over by ISIS or Islamic.
I mean, I'm talking about the areas that are still not taken by ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
Which is basically the west and north of Syria, plus the south, where there is a lot of activism,
mm-hmm.
plus some of the Damascus suburbs. And so there is a lot going on, and people are still active in many different areas, with a number of challenges and a number of risks. So we want to make that visible. And that's work on the long run. It requires a lot of networking and communication and building the global campaign to basically shift the focus away from what the Syrian political class or the opposition elite has been trying to do, which is lobbying and trying to have allies among those different countries, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and so on, which we don't think is an effective way to support the Syrian revolution. And as we have seen, many of those countries have been betraying the Syrian revolution, the Syrian people in different ways. And the only way to go forward is to build a very strong global network of solidarity in a way similar to the BDS movement or the anti-apartheid South African movement.
Mm-hmm. So
that's what we're trying to do.
You were raising these things at the World Social Forum, and
right. So
I understand one of the talks was attacked?
Right. So we were organizing talks about that and trying to have Syrian activists coming from Yarmouk and other areas meet international audiences and telling them about what's happening and how the Syrian people are still struggling and so on. And for the second time, people who support the Syrian regime, thugs, mostly Tunisian and Algerian, and few Syrian, attacked us and tried to prevent us from having this panel. But after removing them and calling the security, we were able to have a very productive and fruitful conversation with a very well-attended panel.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Yasser Munif about Syria. This is Stan Heller for The Struggle. Thanks for listening.